name is Abdiel Vázquez. This is Maestro in Tune. It's great to see you again. What you were listening to is Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto Number 3, and it's a performance from a long time ago in 2006 when I won the national piano competition in Mexico, and you could say this was the beginning of my professional life as a concert pianist. And I play this for you because this is a topic that I discussed with you a couple of episodes ago. And it, of course, lends itself to many other topics on what it means to be a professional. And what came to my mind is this idea that normally you consider yourself a professional when you get paid for the first time. And I'm talking about us artists, musicians. And it's an incredible feeling when you get paid for the first time. Usually you announce this gig to your friends or family and you say something like, wow, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna perform, and on top of that, I'm gonna get paid. The excitement is so much about doing the art, about doing what you love, that getting paid just seems like a bonus. That's how our relationship with money as artists is always a little bit funny, because we are in it really for the love of it. At least originally we get into it for the love of it. And this explains the market, so to speak, when it comes to the fees that are not normally paid to artists, especially artists at the beginning of their careers when they don't really have a name yet, when they're not, so to speak, in high demand. Well, the fees tend to be very low, sometimes what we call symbolic. And this is because there's just so many other people besides yourself that are willing to just do it for free. And there's so many others that are willing to pay to do it, and some even do. There's a whole industry around this. So just getting paid seems like a big deal in and of itself. And once an artist gets important enough or famous enough to the point that they are in demand, so to speak, and they can charge a little bit more, it also feels funny at first. Not that you're doing anything wrong, but even charging more money or negotiating your fee or rejecting a gig if they're not paying you enough, the first times you do it, it truly feels funny. And some artists avoid this altogether for the rest of their lives by getting agents. Usually that's the moment when you get an agent, is when you are really on demand, and you better have someone on your side who has your back, somebody that can come in, that is not yourself, and can negotiate in your behalf and be tough in your behalf and do all those demands on your behalf. Why? Because our relationship with money is funny. And this is what I am gonna talk about today, and try to dig on why is that. And I believe an answer exists, and I believe the answer goes way deep into even what money is and where money comes from. But usually the beginning of the life of an artist doesn't start as an economic calculation the way many other careers do. Even if you love engineering or if you love law, most people who go into these careers, they also do a calculation. They also look at what are the job prospects around that and what kind of future there is financially. And based on that, they take their decisions and their career paths. With musicians, with artists, usually this is not even part of the equation. Or if it is in a very dreamy way. You know, even if you see art as being a very difficult path, you think you are the one who's really gonna make it. You're gonna be the exception. We're gonna be one of those top 1%, 5% of artists who can really just make a living out of their art. And then you go ahead and then invest so much in it. You maybe invest some of your own money, or you manage to get scholarships or to get grants or to get loans. and you also put in so much time and so much sacrifice with no financial calculation behind, because this is not a commercial calculation. It's a human calculation. You're seeing your future as, I want to do what I love and what I am passionate about, and I cannot live without it. Now, stick to those words, human and commercial, because I believe this is going to come up later. Now, naturally, as young artists evolve in their lives, they are hit with the reality, so to speak, of what we call the market, the real world. And then comes a steep learning curve. How many artists have resented their schools, their alma maters, university, college, whatever, for not teaching them the basics of economy and the basics of financial planning, and career planning and marketing and all of that. So many of us just dive deep into like a basic course of economics one-on-one. And it's great to delve into this because it brings so much clarity about the state of the industry, because at the end it is an industry in which you're supposed to survive and thrive in order to pay your bills. So you learned about supply and demand and the market and all of these commercial terms, and suddenly, or maybe gradually, it becomes clear that indeed you are selling something, right? That's what supply and demand deals with. Something is being sold, a product or a service. And in this case, what is it that is being sold? You could say, well, my performances, the way I perform them, the fact that it is me that is performing them. What exactly is the product here? What exactly is the commodity? And things can get very uncomfortable once you realize that what you are selling indeed is yourself. You start thinking of yourself as a sort of commodity, as a sort of a product. And then you have to come to terms with that. And some people shy away from it, some people embrace it fully, and some people just accept it as this is what it is, this is how the world works. So now I have to think of myself as a little corporation, as a little business, and therefore think of my branding, of my marketing, about the marketability of my products, of what I'm offering, on whether I need to repackage it in a different way so that it has wider appeal, and so on and so forth. And once again, it starts feeling funny. And this is all over the place. No matter where you end up, positioned in for or against it or whatever, around being a commodity yourself, clearly the feelings are very strong, and even the feelings of others. That's why the idea of calling an artist a sellout is a thing at all, or feeling some sort of guilt because you have to maybe sacrifice some of the art in order to think more of a commercial, or there may be some guilt about it, or at some point there could just be a complete, okay, let's just embrace it, this is what I'm gonna do, and no matter what the critics say. But still, the fact that we have to come to terms with this, to me, is important enough to look into, beyond just saying, well, this is how the world is. Why? Because even in other professions, it doesn't seem to be that difficult to think of what you do as, selling yourself, or thinking of it as a commodity. When it comes to, I mentioned earlier, engineers and lawyers, they very much are in it for the money many times, and nobody gives a second thought about it. Think about factory workers, or government bureaucrats or office workers or anything like that. And there's a sense that what they do, what they're selling, what they're working for is something outside of themselves. It's something external, even if they have to put in a bit of themselves into it, definitely. And not just their time and their effort and their care, but sometimes even their love and their passion. But still, we're dealing with external products that at the end are the ones, being sold. That's the product of your labor. Even in the case of doctors, we accept that they're both in it to save lives and for the money. And we don't really think much of it. We actually even say, well, all the better. And I think this difference with artists, which as you will see is not so much of a difference as just a scale of uncomfortability. The artists are at the bottom of it because when it comes to what we do, it truly feels that is something that's from the bottom of our hearts, from the bottom of our humanity. So how can we possibly put a price on that? Now, I talk about the scale because this is also the case with the other professions. Even if we accept that most people are in their professions for the money as much as for their passion for what they're doing, we absolutely vilify those people who are in it only for the money, or we see them as shallow or as hollow. And it's a funny contradiction because even the richest billionaire entrepreneurs who are by definition in it for the money, they have to tell themselves and the rest of the world that they're in it to make the world a better place, to save humanity and to make things better for everyone. It just so happens that they're becoming the richest people in the world in the process. It almost seems evil or heartless to admit that you're just in it because you love being rich and you are in it for the money. And we also see this in the case, let's not talk about necessarily the richest people in the world, but even any normal profession, when somebody cuts corners or when somebody doesn't fulfill their obligations towards others, when they exploit others in order to make money, even if they do it in a, so to speak, legal way, we don't like that. We look down upon that. So clearly, we have feelings against the idea of pursuing money at any cost. So where do we draw the line, right? The artists that don't pursue money, at all costs, at all, or the richest entrepreneur in the world who does pursue money while maybe engaging in all kinds of exploitative or the mischievous practices. Where in between is really the permissible amount of greed that humans should have. And of course, it's impossible to draw this line or to see where it is in the scale. That is a point that I'm trying to make. This seems to be a dilemma that has not been solved, and that mostly when we reach these points where we cannot fully solve it, we just brush it aside, accept things as they are, and just try to deal with it the best we can. We keep our humanity, we know we have to pay our bills, yes, let's be commercial about everything, and just don't think too much about it. Now, why am I trying to give all this introduction? It basically want to make the point first that these dilemmas are not new at all. So the fact that we have them and that there's still a topic of conversation everywhere, it could be about your everyday life, it could be about the nature of money in friendships, it could be about the nature of money, in your job, or even in politics in general. This dilemma is very much part of our lives, but it has been going on for a couple thousand years. some people may confuse this with forever, right? But let me tell you about this, that when you see the major religions, the ones that developed around the time that our anthropologists or historians call the axial age, which is somewhere between like 600 or 800 before Christ all the way to 600, 700 after Christ. So it's a period of barely 1,000 years where we have Christianity, and we have Islam, and we have Buddhism, and we have the Greek philosophers. All of that developed around the same time. And it's an interesting time in the world because all the places where this developed were places where civilization, or what we call civilization, started growing. That's where empires were being formed. And suddenly we see these conversations start to happen. It's really no coincidence that a lot of the language of the morality of these different religions or philosophies revolves around money, even if invisibly. The Christianity talks about sins or debts that have to be redeemed. This is language of the market. You have Islam that completely forbids usury, which is lending money at interest. You have Buddhism with its rejection of everything that's material, and so on. You see where I'm going with this? Even Plato's Republic, the beginning of this wonderful treatise on politics, starts with a discussion on the morality of paying debts. Now, we don't need to go into a deeper analysis on this. This is only to prove that this conversation on money and sort of morality and how we feel funny about money has been going on for a long time. And people have tried to find different solutions around it, but clearly the problems are still with us today. Now, the fact that these dilemmas have been going on for as long as what seems to be much of recorded history or written history would make us believe that therefore we are dealing with a core aspect of humanity, about something in our nature that just is there, and therefore these are things that humans, when they live in society and with each other, just have had to deal with since the dawn of time. But this is very misleading because we're talking about roughly 2,000, 2,500 years of human history, and 2,500 years in very specific places. It's only over the last, 300 to 500 years, after the colonization of the world and then the industrial era and finally the globalization, that these ideas have taken hold over the whole world. So yes, you may think that we're just dealing with core aspects of human nature. We forget that humans have been around for way longer than that. So had they been dealing with this before we see the appearance of all these philosophies and all this recorded history, or were they dealing with things in a different way? Now, in order to have the answer, we would need to go back to the prehistory, which is of course very, very difficult by definition. However, we do have some evidence of how things have been. We have actually overwhelming evidence of how the world is outside of civilizations, let's say, or communities that develop this commercial economy around money and markets. And this is very important because now we have to go into the origin of money and markets. And this is where things get kind of interesting and kind of dark. Now, first, I want to tell you very briefly something that you probably already know, which is traditional history of money, which is something that Adam Smith wrote in his Wealth of Nations. The very first chapter deals with this, and then his theory has just been replicated blindly by all economists in all the economic books up to this century. And he basically states that it all starts with barter, because humans have a tendency to barter, and humans have different abilities and talents, and therefore you may become very good at building arrows, and somebody else may become very good at putting roofs for houses, and somebody else is even better at growing tomatoes. So of course, if you have a bunch of arrows that you don't need, but you want some tomatoes, you go to that person and you want to barter, and both people will be like, well, but I do not need arrows, and but so how can I give you my tomatoes, And it seems like it's a very intractable problem. And Adam Smith goes on to say that, well, this is how money gets created, because they find a common thing that they can exchange, instead of having to figure out how many tomatoes are worth how many arrows or cows or roofs or whatever, it is. And this story has been taken at face value and just accepted as the truth because it feels like it might be. But the funny thing about it is that we have never found evidence that this is true whatsoever. If this were the case, we would see this all over the place. We would see this when the Europeans arrived to America and they got to see how the indigenous people all over the Americas dealt with in their own local economies. We would see this in the tribes in the New Guinea and Australia and New Zealand and all over Oceania when they were discovered. We would see this in the tribes of Northern Europe in the Roman times. We would see this in Africa. We would see this everywhere, and yet we don't. There's no place, time in history where barter has somehow given way to money. And Adam Smith himself would admit that he was not a historian. He was a theorist. He was a political theorist, a moral philosopher. So he was not saying this is how things were. He was just saying this is how things might have been. So what is the true origin of money? What do we see when anthropologists go see these other civilizations, both in the past and in the present? To this day, there are still, tribes in the Amazonia and tribes in the islands of Oceania, north of Australia. There's still this kind of communities everywhere in the world. So we may get a glimpse of what societies have been like throughout history, societies that haven't been touched by this so-called modern world. And what we see is something very, very different. And this is where I want to come back to the idea of the human economies and the commercial economies. Basically, when it comes to the everyday needs, the so-called commercial economies, you have a system of truly exchange, but mostly credit and favors. And this is at the core of how communities stick together. The reality is that if I have a bunch of arrows and I need tomatoes, but my neighbor doesn't need arrows, most likely that neighbor will be happy to give me the tomatoes, knowing that I could do something for them in the future. And it doesn't have to be giving them arrows. It could be doing some job for them, or helping them when they get married, or in the next hunt, or what. There's so many things in which we develop our connections towards each other, and where we don't mind an economy where we do favors to each other, where we do, take care of each other's needs, knowing that our needs will also be taken care of when we need, when the time comes. So this is something that we see everywhere, and sometimes it's very, very organized. We have the Iraqis, the famous long houses where everybody would hunt and plant and cultivate and harvest and everything, and all the products of everything would be brought to the elderly women of the Iraqi tribes, and everything collected in these big long houses like warehouses, and then they would decide how to distribute all of this according to what people were needing. And different societies organize themselves in different ways. The point is that nobody really came up with the idea of just exchanging money in order to buy things like the way you do in a market. Now, did they exchange things? And this is where this gets very interesting. There was, what we could think of as money, meaning objects, whether precious rocks or precious metals, things that were of use in those tribes that were considered valuable and that were sometimes used, for the exchange of something. But this would only be used for what's called like human economy. And this has to do with things that cannot be given value in the marketplace. We're not talking about tomatoes or cows or a musical instrument. We're talking about, for example, getting married. It was very common to give, as a groom, as a man, to give something to the family of the bride once you get married. But in tribes everywhere, all these societies would make it very clear that no, we are not buying the bride. She's getting married out of her own will. She can separate of her own will. It's just a symbolism of compensation, because I'm taking your daughter away from you, and since I cannot make up for this, there's nothing equivalent to a human life, I will give you these pieces of brass or gold in return. And usually there was a number there. It could have been, 40 pieces of brass rods. And then this is the same type of money that would be used when there were what we call blood feuds, meaning somebody got into a dispute with someone else and killed them. Well, now the family of the victim has a feud against me, and rightly so, and they demand revenge, they demand blood. And many times the elders of the tribe would come and try to mediate the arrangement, and at the end, the perpetrator could be forgiven if they gave some compensation to the family. And this compensation came also in the way of valuable material like gold or silver, that whatever the currency was for these human transactions. And the point of this transaction was exactly that you cannot substitute for the life of the person. This is just a symbolic element. So this is not, I'm not exchanging one thing for the other. It's just a symbol of how this has no value. It's unquantifiable, the value of this. This is very different from saying I am buying this. But you can see, you may already be seeing where this is going. You're talking about using something that's very similar to money to represent things that cannot be given value. Okay, human things. Where meanwhile in the commercial world, they were not using any of this money. It was a system of trust and credit and favors and interconnectedness among community. Now, this is where things get interesting and a little dark. What happens when a particular society ends up developing a knack for violence and for conquest? And this would happen indeed, because it's not that it's human nature, is that it is sometimes human nature in some humans. So indeed, some humans will have a propensity for violence and for conquest, and they would go and take. And what we see when we have wars is that some of the first things that are taken are other humans, are slaves, and mostly women, then also men. But it started with taking women, and since the slaves were being taken, they could be bought and sold. Sometimes they could even be bought back by the tribe or society from which they were taken from. Now, what would the price for the slave be if you were to buy back a slave? Well, eventually, many times, and we see snapshots of this in Africa where this process took place in a very short amount of time because of the violence of the European conquest on it, you know? Whereas in other places, this process took a much longer time, so it's impossible to see how gradually it changed. But just imagine the moral dilemma that it would bring if the same amount of money that you have been using for your human transactions of a wedding or like a blood feud, the money that is supposed to represent the fact that you cannot put value on a human life. What if this is the same money that is used to buy a slave for the same amount, to buy back a slave, to buy someone's freedom? Or if that slave was definitely taken away somewhere else, it gets bought somewhere else. The person gets bought with the same money that was supposed to mean that we cannot put value on a human person. Suddenly, the use of money gets very uncomfortable. Now, it gets a little bit darker because when soldiers would travel through the conquering lands, besides taking slaves, they would also take booty. They would pillage the town, and they would mostly pillage it for valuable things. You know, the sculptures, the gods, and all of this, you know, would be melted and made into gold, and the slaves would be sent to the mines to get more gold. Why? Because the government needed to pay their soldiers, and then at the end, these soldiers needed to eat, and the soldiers have their necessities. And if they're in your city and you have something to offer, you know, you're not going to fight these violent conquerors. You might as well just capitulate and play along. So if you're a merchant, you may have to sell your products to these conquering soldiers. And because, unlike in your community where things can be based on trust and on credit and on favors and interconnectedness toward each other, when you're dealing with a soldier, a violent person who you may never see again, it's best to just use money. Money started first being used by soldiers in conquered populations. And for the government, this was useful. And by government, I mean whoever was the king that would send those soldiers, you know. But this was useful because then the king would demand tribute from the conquered lands. And said tribute could only be paid in the money that was being used for this transaction. So it became like a whole circular, you know, industry of conquest. You have slaves going to the mines, you have booty that gets molten into like coins, and these coins are being used to pay the local vendors so that these vendors can give the tribute back to the king, and then the king could pay the soldiers so that they can go do even more conquests. The more an empire wanted to expand, the more land it needed, the more it needed workers, slaves, you know, to keep this growing and not collapsing. Now you can see where this is going, right? The origin of money is intertwined and connected with war and with slavery. So if we feel funny about it, it's precisely because it is weird and it's so ingrained in our lives and in our system today that it's almost invisible. But there's a part of us that is uncomfortable with it. And I'll give you some examples and how it connects with what I've been saying. If you are hired today, because technically slavery does not exist anymore, you are free. You are free to decide where do you rent yourself, to whom do you rent yourself. So you are technically not free, at least not if you want to get paid, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. while you're in that office. And while you're there, to what extent are you owned during that time? Can the boss yell at you? Can the boss, abuse you emotionally? Or in the case of, warehouse workers or field workers, can they be abused physically, but they are working for someone. Technically, they decided to do this, right? It feels strange. Are you, in a way, selling yourself or renting yourself out? What does it mean as a musician, as an artist, when you are hired for your art? Are you supposed to, does your art now belong to the person who hired you? And is what they're paying you what your value is? And now they own you, at least for that project, or now they own your art, or now they own how you're going to present your art, or at least they can tell you how to do it, because we're the ones paying you. It creates a lot of conflict. So when you think about getting paid for your art, is this a symbolism of how your art cannot be valued, the value of your art cannot be measured? Or is this just an actual purchase of a product, of a commodity? This is a question that it's at the core of our uncomfortability and our funny relationship with money. Now, I'm not saying that I have the answer or that I have the solution, especially if you think that, well, it seems like we may just have to overthrow all of it, but this just seems impossible. How do we live in this world, or how do we reconcile these ideas? To me, at least, it gives me peace to know that I am not crazy and that I'm not alone in this, and that there's a reason on why we feel funny about money, and that it's not because this is a question that has been going on since the dawn of humanity. This is a very recent phenomenon, and we're still dealing with the moral consequences of it, of the fact that our modern world is based on conquest, on war, and on exploitation, and not just based in it, it's sustained by it to this day, currently. So the money that we use in our everyday transactions to buy milk and to buy eggs, and that we pay in taxes and that is paid to us for our beautiful art, is also money that is used to exploit some miners in some faraway country, or exploit some sweatshop workers, in some other faraway country, or send bombs to some other faraway country, or sometimes to send police to some neighborhood nearby. It's everywhere, and that's where the moral dilemma comes from. Now, before we try to go into anything systemic, because this may be overwhelming, let's just talk about how can an artist deal with this. And the way I have managed to reconcile it is to truly understand that what we do has no value, has no quantifiable value, if you allow me to say that in a much better way. Its worth cannot be measured in money. Why? Because it's human. It's at the core of our humanity, and nothing can substitute for it. And that's why every artist is unique, and that's why every form of art comes from the bottom of someone's soul and is expression of someone's soul, and you cannot put value in this. You cannot put a number in this. So whenever a number is put in it, I want to believe that it is symbolic of the fact precisely that you cannot quantify it. And if at the end, yes, you have to choose a number, then most of the times that number is chosen according to the current state of the market, to the supply and demand. But the fact that we end up settling on a number depending on what the demand is for what you're offering and where do you stand in that market does not mean that it's a value that translates to yourself or to your worth as an artist or to the art that you produce. And even if this may just seem like some mental juggling, I believe it's absolutely necessary for our own mental health and our own sense of worth as artists. Of course, we're ecstatic when we get paid because we are doing it for our souls. We're not doing it for the money. We need the money. We absolutely need the money to survive and to thrive. And this is the world we live in. So we learn to put ourselves out there in the market, to sell a little bit of ourselves or to rent a little bit of ourselves and to commodify a little bit of ourselves. But as I say this, I hope that all the artists listening to this, even those who will fully embrace the industry and the commercial economy around it so that they can thrive doing their art, do so knowing that they can also keep their humanity. They can keep it, I would say, almost intact, as long as you know that your art is valuable in and of itself. Nobody can put a quantity value, nobody can quantify how much the expression of your soul is worth. And I think that is worth a lot. My name is Abdiel Vázquez. This is Maestro in Tune, and I will leave you with the ending of this wonderful, amazing Rachmaninoff Third Piano Concerto, as played by myself in 2006 with the National Symphony Orchestra of Mexico in Mexico City, Palacio de Bellas Artes, the finals of the Angélica Morales National Piano Competition. I hope you enjoy, and I will see you next time.